Well, good morning, everyone. Well, we were just listening to Elvis Presley singing Marie's the name of his latest flame. Well, that kind of applies to Ernest Hemingway. He was the man who was married many times, had many affairs. A lot of people would classify him as a womanizer, so I thought that might be a little appropriate. Not to mention he was a world traveler, and plenty of the places that he traveled to and wrote about have inspired us to, well, travel and see some of these places that he wrote about in his novels. And, of course, he was a man who loved the sea, and, of course, he wrote, the Nobel Prize-winning book, The Old Man and the Sea. So he loved fishing, he loved the water, he loved to adventure, and he loved a lot of different women. So let's talk about Ernest Hemingway. All right. Before him, books were written with flowery elegance. Sentences before him were plump, and no detail was considered too small to be overlooked. So this was the style of writers like Dickens and Wordsworth and all the rest of the very talented 19th century writers. After him, though, our books took on a new tone. And his descriptions were brash, subjects were stared down, and the language that he used reflected the language of the people, and this was something a little bit different. So literature reached a turning point on the genius of none other than Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway grew into the man that we know today by traveling the world. He spent time in Spain and Paris and Italy and Cuba and Florida, even the American West, and that all lays claim to part of his legend. But no place or no one can own what Hemingway has become. Least of all, oddly enough, or ironically enough, the man himself. Excuse me. His reputation grew owing to the largeness of his life and his adventures. No geographical boundaries or intellectual boundaries limited Ernest Hemingway. He was a correspondent of the world. His travels and stories knew no limits, and they excelled, at the fringes of society. Hemingway's stories, as his life, were guided by adventure. So he would taste fame, he would earn the world's highest literary award, he would hobnob with Hollywood celebrities, and so much of his passion and his essence can be traced to, one small part of the world, because of his love of deep-sea fishing, freedom, and what some people describe as easy living. Ernest Hemingway chose to live his life along the edge of the Gulf Stream. Ernest Hemingway was born in Oak Park, Illinois, 1899. He grew up around the Great Lakes, spending some of the time in the wilds of the Midwest wilderness regions. How many people here from Michigan? Anyone here from Michigan? Okay. Well, he spent a lot of time in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan hunting and fishing, and he wrote stories about those experiences as well. This did, of course, foster a love of hunting and fishing for Ernest, and throughout his childhood he developed a sense of adventure, a sense that would essentially and fundamentally define his life. So for someone who throughout his life had carefully crafted his persona, he couldn't have timed it any better. Pushed at the birth of a new and expanding century, Hemingway would do for writing what the Wright brothers and Henry Ford did for transportation. Hemingway's economical and visceral writing would transport millions of readers to previously unknown experiences the world over. And it's writing about these experiences that inspire us to travel and adventure, whether we're on a cruise ship or on land, but we owe some of that certainly directly to Ernest Hemingway. As a young man, Hemingway, he had itchy feet. I think it was in his DNA to be a gypsy. After finishing high school, he took a job at the Kansas City Star, a local newspaper, and the style of writing he learned in that job would stay with him for the rest of his career. His editor at the Kansas City Star famously gave him this bit of advice which became prophetic words to guide his career. And this is what he said. Ernest, use short sentences. Use short first paragraph. Use vigorous English, not forgetting to strive for smoothness. Be positive, not negative. And that became a guiding force in his style of innovating a different way of writing. So in World War I, he was a volunteer. Even before he was 20 years old, he found himself in the action of World War I, first as a volunteer ambulance driver, and then later as a soldier. So here, several incidents occurred that would stay with him for the rest of his life. A passion for crafting stories out of war zones, injury, and a love for the women in his life. As a volunteer driver, his ambulance was hit by an enemy shell, and Hemingway was wounded. Well, when he was wounded on the front line, one of the first of the many, and I mean many, significant women would enter his life. And later, she would enter one of his novels. Her name was Agnes von Kurowski. She was a Red Cross nurse, 8 years older than the young writer. And though Ernest was dogged in his pursuits, they never ended up together. So in the end, it was the nurse who rejected the aspiring writer. This didn't happen to Ernest very often, by the way. So when Ernest was fully healed, he headed back to America. Here he used his misfortune of the incident to boost his burgeoning persona with a flair for media that would in time come to characterize the writer. Hemingway's influence could be read behind the newspaper headlines that proclaimed his return. So take a look at some of these headlines. Newspaper man survives 200 battle wounds. That grabs people's attention. Oak Park boy shot to pieces. Jokes about it. Well, that grabbed people's attention very easily as well. Yankee punctured by 227 pieces of Austrian shrapnel. So these were the kind of headlines for the stories he wrote about his adventures when he was in World War I. So when he returned, he met and married a woman named Hadley Richardson, also coincidentally much older than the aspiring writer. With his new bride on his arm, Hemingway headed back to the action, relocating this time in Paris as a reporter. It was in Paris he soon became a lead voice in what was to become known as the Lost Generation. This was the term used to describe the generation of young people who came of age after World War I and before the Great Depression in 1929, many of whom were disillusioned by the mores of their parents' generation. Being a child of the 60s, I kind of relate to this. So some of his friends, Lost Generation friends, some very, very famous people. F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, Ford Maddox, James Joyce, Ezra Pound. So around the cafe tables in Paris, this was a very talented group of writers and various visual artists. They fused their talents and their creativity and were the members of the Lost Generation group surrounding Ernest Hemingway. They were also, I have to add this, they were a legendary bunch of drinkers as well, so they did a lot of drinking in those cafes, but none of them could challenge Ernest Hemingway in that particular regard. In other words, Hemingway could drink any one of them under the table. Well, he developed a worldview and found inspiration in thrill-seeking. For the rest of his life, he would wear a reminder those days. He grew a mustache at 23, which he never shaved off, and then he received a sizable scar on his forehead one evening when he mistakenly pulled down a skylight thinking the cord would flush the toilet. Excuse me, I got a little cold. While Hemingway was spending quite a bit of time in Paris, he was paid to travel around Europe. He was very fortunate. He had an opportunity to sell stories of personal adventure to the Toronto Star, an ongoing contract that allowed him and his family to make ends meet while in Europe. So on these side trips, he went to many of the attractions that tourists are drawn to today. But back in the 1920s, these events were only attended by locals. For example, like the running of the bulls in Spain. Very few foreigners had ever attended this particular event. In a real way, Hemingway opened the door on many of the great European festivals that we know about today. So while he was getting paid by the Toronto Star, he also began writing his first novel. That book, of course, was The Sun Also Rises. It was very much based on his experiences with the easygoing lifestyle that he was living in Paris at the time. Much of the novel focuses on a group of artists, again, the lost generation, with which he was hanging out with at that time. Well, his friends critiqued his work, and doing so seemed to inspire greatness in Ernest Hemingway. But perhaps the sharpest critique of Hemingway's first novel, it did not come from the literary world, but from a source much closer to the writer. Taking offense of the light, undisciplined, laissez-faire lifestyle of the characters, Hemingway's own father commented, "You surely are now famous as a writer, and I shall trust your future books will have a different sort of subject matter. You have such wonderful ability, and we want to be able to read and ask others to enjoy your works." But it was his mother who was the harshest critic of his first novel, The Sun Also Rises. She just simply, as you can see right here, that's what she said, one of the filthiest books of the year. Well, with a collection of short stories and numerous published essays drawn from his time in Europe, Ernest Hemingway's 20s were coming to a close. As was his first marriage with Hadley Richardson, with whom he had a son. His son's name was Bumby. That's B-U-M-B-Y. But this did provide Hemingway with an opportunity to move, to go someplace new. So Hemingway had become interested also in a friend of Hadley's, a young Vogue writer and wealthy heiress by the name of Pauline Pfeiffer. Hadley, realizing that the marriage was about to end, forbade the two to see each other for 6 months. So this was a test of whether the love between her friend and her husband were true. Well, after the 6 months expired, Hadley got her divorce, and within weeks, Pauline and Ernest were married. But to Hadley's credit, she took care of herself as well. Not only did she get a sincere dedication in Ernest's novel, The Sun Also Rises, which was, by the way, published in 1926, but Ernest, he was generous. He was generous enough that all the royalties from the publication of the book he gave to Hadley. So with that settled, Ernest and Pauline left Paris and the lost generation behind. But the stories about what he experienced throughout his 20s would dominate a great deal of his writing as he entered his 30s. So, following up on a lead by a fellow Lost Generation writer, John Dos Passos, Pauline and Ernest found their way to Key West, Florida, by way of Havana. An incident happened to the newly married couple that would lead them to extend their stay much longer than either would have anticipated. So in 1928, Key West was only connected to the mainland and other Florida keys by a rail line. And also back in the 20s, it was one of the most remote areas of America. And that, of course, was one of the characteristics that Hemingway would come to love about this place. So they decided to move to Key West. And again, it was very, very isolated, very small population, and they ended up staying there much longer than they ever anticipated. Well, it was, again, that easygoing lifestyle in Key West just south of Miami, and again at the time one of the most remote areas of the U.S. Well, it appealed to the couple so much that they chose to remain for years. And Hemingway at this point in his career was into a good routine of writing. His works were being well received, and he became a father of 2 more sons. With all the good, sometimes comes the bad, and unfortunately, his own father died about the same time. Kind of an eerie twist of fate. His father did suffer from mental illness. Clarence Hemingway ended his life just as his son Ernest would some 35 years later. So by 1930, Hemingway's writing career was continuing to blossom with another successful novel, this one, of course, entitled Farewell to Arms, which was published in 1929. A true-to-life story about a wounded war correspondent on the Italian front and, of course, his fascination with a Red Cross nurse. Well, he described the character as this. Miss Barkley was quite tall. She wore what seemed to me to be a nurse's uniform, was blonde and had tawny skin and gray eyes. I thought she was very beautiful. Clearly, Hemingway was reliving his encounters via Catherine Barkley, this character from his time as a wounded soldier in Italy. The novel, like many others, would closely mirror the events of his life. So Hemingway was also beginning to write regular features for Esquire and other magazines. Many of these, again, would be based on his life in Key West, and he did as much to forward his writing career as to build his legend. So while the couple were making ends meet, they continued to rent a very small house in Key West, a very modest home. 3 years after moving to the island, the Hemingways moved into a Spanish colonial villa on Whitehead Street. Some of you have been to Key West. You've probably paid a visit to it. Pauline's rich uncle, Gus Pfeiffer, bought the home. Now, isn't this nice? He bought them that home as an overdue wedding present. The house cost $8,000 at the time. Remember that figure. Just this house, this beautiful house, cost $8,000. So this house would forever reinforce the Hemingway name with Key West, Florida, which you can still visit today. Well, Hemingway was more than a writer. He lived big. His reputation built in the cafes of Paris as a drinker and a womanizer crossed the Atlantic with him. Before long, he was firmly entrenched in the social scene on the island. So whereas Prohibition was causing, well, how should we put it, a bit of disruption of the good times elsewhere in America, well, down in Key West again was off the beaten track, had an easygoing nature that contributed to, well, we can only describe it as a lively drinking scene. So within the first few years of living in Key West, rumor has it that Hemingway became a silent partner in an illegal speakeasy known as the Silver Slipper. And what is known is that Hemingway was a regular customer. This part we know is a fact. And then he convinced a gentleman named Joe Russell to rename the bar from Silver Slipper to Sloppy Joe's. A bar remains in the location of the original Sloppy Joe's, even though the bar currently with that name relocated across the street. But Sloppy Joe's in Key West remains to this day the epicenter, if you will, of Hemingway mania, from their yearly Hemingway look-alike competition, memorabilia is on the wall, and of course, drink specials with names referring to some of his work or the man himself. Captain Tony's, as you see pictured here, that was the site of the original Sloppy Joe's, and now the Sloppy Joe's is right across the street. So Hemingway's daily routine in Key West often included writing in the cool morning hours, and it almost invariably included some sport fishing in the afternoon. He was introduced to deep-sea fishing in the early months of his residency by none other than Sloppy Joe Russell and a local hardware store owner named Charles Thompson. Hemingway quickly became a huge fan of deep-sea fishing, And before long, his outgoing personality and growing stardom attracted many people who wanted to fish alongside one of America's most famous writers. So they nicknamed themselves. They called themselves the Key West Mob, a ragtag group of drinkers and fishermen who would set out to sea for days at a time, working the Gulf Stream for billfish, and also working each other for stories. So each, quote, mobster would earn a nickname. And Hemingway was henceforth known from hanging out with this gang of so-called misfits. He would be known from now on as Papa Hemingway. So that's where he acquired that nickname. Well, the Gulf Stream is a very highly productive zone for marine life. Hemingway likened it to a blue river, warm tropical currents sweeping up from Mexico, squeezing through Florida and Cuba on the way out to the Atlantic. So this was an area where some of the finest bill fishing was to be had in the world. The Key West Mob would enjoy, again, some of the best fishing for marlin and swordfish anywhere in the world. So on one of these fishing adventures, the Hemingway mob, they got just out past Key West, and they were near the island of Dry Tortugas, which now, as then, is home to an old military fort called Fort Jefferson. It's been a long, since idle fortification built in the 1860s. But Russell, Hemingway, and the rest of the mob, they were caught in a sudden tropical storm with only the Dry Tortuga for shelter. Fortunately for them, they had a highly skilled Cuban captain by the name of Gregorio Fuentes, who was at the helm and was able to find safe anchorage. Hemingway never forgot Fuentes, nor would the literary world some 20 years later. Though Hemingway's daily adventures were lived in the Gulf Stream, most of his writing at this time involved his past experiences in Europe and Africa. So following on the success of A Farewell to Arms, a movie adaptation of the novel was in the works, so times were getting even better for Ernest Hemingway. So Hemingway's novels were made into almost a dozen films, but he was never much of a fan of the reworked plots and some of the ways Hollywood was required to redo the story just for the sake of filmmaking. So upon completing several deals with Hollywood producers, Hemingway said to come up with the following advice to give you an idea of the man. You throw them the book, they throw you the money. Then you jump in your car and drive like hell back the way you came. Well, Hemingway obviously wasn't real thrilled with the whole process, but he was glad to have the money and go home and go back to fishing and his wife and have a great time with the mob. So that's the way he summed it up. He did, however, enjoy interacting with Hollywood celebrities. And in fact, he struck up a lifelong friendship with Gary Cooper. And he played, of course, the lead in the adaptation of A Farewell to Arms. So Hemingway lived in America from 1928 1940. Again, most of his work, though, was centered on stories from far away. The exception was a story, though, that was too close to home to be ignored. And this one was To Have and to Have Not. It came straight out of the tales that those Key West mob guys would share out on the fishing boats. Harry Morgan, the protagonist, fisherman, rum smuggler, is actually based loosely on Sloppy Joe Russell. So no doubt the adventures of smuggling rum between Cuba and Florida during Prohibition were inspired by some, well, industrious preliminary research that the pair completed over the years. So To Have and to Have Not was eventually adapted into a film in 1944. Unlike the book, which was actually set in Cuba, the film is set on the French island of Martinique, and the villains have now been transformed into the Nazis. So in spite of the changes, it must have been quite a thrill to see his good friend and running mate being portrayed by none other than Humphrey Bogart. I would say a perfect compliment to a man that lived his life on its own terms as well. And the have and the have-not came on the heels of Casablanca. It never received the same kind of status as Casablanca. So there was one line in the film, the have and the have-not, that did take on legendary status. So there's this little piece of dialogue. And the film also debuted a 19-year-old Lauren Bacall. So in the performance, the exchange between Harry Morgan and Lauren Bacall, she's walking up a flight of stairs, and he's wondering what to do next and when he's going to see her again. And she just looks down and says, "You know how to whistle, don't you? You just put your lips together and blow." So Hemingway became increasingly interested in the Spanish Civil War through the mid-1930s, and like in the First World War, he chose to cross over the sidelines and travel to Spain to experience war firsthand. In this experience, he supported the Republic side of the battle and managed to get close to the front lines, and one battle in particular over a strategic bridge. So while Hemingway was enjoying professional success, by the late 1930s, his marriage with Pauline was becoming strained. While in Spain, he met yet another woman, another journalist. Her name was Martha Gellhorn. And folks, they had an affair overseas. Well, after disappearing with the mob for a week, Hemingway one day returned to the house on Whitehead, only to discover a swimming pool had been built. The first ever for Key West, in fact. So remember, the entire house cost $8,000 6 years previously. So he finally said to his wife, "So how much did this swimming pool cost?" And she told Ernest, "Well, $20,000. So legend has it, he had a little sticker shock, shall we say, and he emptied out his pockets, he threw down a penny, and he muttered to his wife, "You might as well have every last penny." So being sly in her one right, Pauline set that penny into a concrete walkway, and that penny remains there today at the house in Key West. So certainly the house on Whitehead Street is perhaps the best known Hemingway landmark in America. Certainly a must-see for anyone who visits Key West. And there you can see the penny, you can see the pool, you can see the Bath Library, portraits of the writer, and you can meet any of the 60 or so polydactyl Hemingway cats. Polydactyl cats are cats with 6 toes. Well, by 1940, Hemingway's second marriage with Pauline had ended. His third marriage to journalist Martha Gellhorn, well, had already begun, and he decided it was time to move again. So the second wife, and again, being very generous, the second wife got the Key West house, Hemingway got Martha, and a new home in Cuba. Well, by this time, his adventures in Spain during the Civil War yielded For Whom the Bells Toll, a tremendous literary success as the world was tumbling into a Second World War. This novel was completed in a hotel room in Havana, Cuba. So like many of its other novels, this one also ended up making it out to Hollywood. It was yet another film starring his very good friend, Gary Cooper. Well, he moved out of the hotel in Havana, got a new house just overlooking the sea, about 9 miles outside of Havana. At this time, Havana was a bustling place full of American tourists and American tourist dollars. Hemingway just, well, he liked a little isolation. He liked his little retreat. That's why he moved 9 miles out of town. But he also still cherished the time he spent in, what else can you call it, his favorite watering holes. Papa, as he was then widely known throughout the region, was a legend in a local bar. He would sit in the back corner and order what they referred to as the Papa Double. This would be a very strong double daiquiri. You can try one on the ship. By this time in his life, Hemingway was well settled in and very much enjoying his life in the sun. He was enjoying his celebrity. He enjoyed fishing in the Gulf Stream. Things were going extremely well. And again, fishing was one of the things he really cherished about living in the region. So you could say at this point in his life, he was truly at the apex of his career. So although he no longer had Joe Russell down the block to go fishing with, by this time in Cuba he assembled an eclectic group of friends, and then with the money he was earning from, well, selling his novels to Hollywood, he purchased his own boat, the 38-foot motorboat, which he called the Pilar. And who do you think he would choose to be the captain of his brand new boat? None other than Gregorio Fuentes, the Cuban captain, that rescued them when they were almost shipwrecked just outside Key West. So Fuentes and Hemingway and an ever-changing league of fishermen worked and played in the Gulf Stream. They caught record-breaking marlins that would dwarf the size of the crew members. Hemingway would write of his exploits in magazines, again, such as Esquire, but his novels were still focused on his fascination with conflict and adventure elsewhere. So much of Hemingway's time in Cuba was spent writing thousands of letters, which, for whatever reason, he kept a separate desk for writing letters, and then he kept another desk for writing on his novels or articles. But the thrill of combat would soon stir Hemingway's spirit for adventure yet again. In 1942, a German U-boat cruised undetected through Caribbean waters and bombed a gasoline and diesel refinery on the island of Aruba. It was a strategic strike, provided because these ships were providing fuel to the merchant and naval fleets for America and her allies. So, actually, by November 1942, German U-boats in the Caribbean sank some 263 ships. So America at the time didn't really have the capacity to confront the situation militarily. So Hemingway had an inspiration of all his own. Well, while he was in Europe, Hemingway had seen civilian vessels put to use against the enemy in covert operations. So he decided to